The wind howls like a starving beast tonight, its breath soaked in salt and sorrow. Beneath your cracked leather boots, the deck groans, a slow wooden cry beneath 1,000 pounding waves. Somewhere behind you, a man coughs blood into his sleeve. Somewhere ahead, nothing exists but fog and the promise of land that may never be. Your fingers are numb, your lips split from thirst. The stars above look on in silence, as if they've grown weary of watching men die for gold they'll never see. You are a sailor now, bound to the keel by duty, by hunger, and by dreams that no longer feel like your own. The sea does not remember your name, but it will take it anyway. If this story chills your bones or stirs your soul, subscribe and stay with me. Would you have stepped aboard, knowing what waited beyond the horizon? The harbour smelled of rot and salt and promises no one could keep. A gull wheeled overhead, crying out like a soul in a storm. Beneath it you stood ankle deep, in brine, boots heavy with the weight of soaked leather and quiet decisions. Around you the wooden ribs of ships creaked in the tide, like old men trying to rise from prayer. Their sails were furled, but their masts pointed like spears into the grey sky. Some called them cathedrals of ambition, others coffins waiting to close. Behind you the tavern doors still swung from the last fight. A boy bled from the temple and smiled through cracked teeth. Ahead, the ships waited. You had no one to bid farewell, no belongings save the knife in your belt, and the letter in your boot, folded and unsigned. And still, as your foot touched the plank, as the rope groaned and the ship's shadow swallowed you, you wondered if you were walking into a miracle, or a mistake that would last the rest of your life. But the sea does not care for such questions. It only waits to answer in waves. If this story stirs something buried in your bones, subscribe and stay close. The tides have only begun to speak. Tell me in the comments, would you have taken that first step aboard? The year is 1519, and Spain is hungry. Not the kind of hunger cured by bread or coin, but something wider, more fevered. A hunger for land, for gold, for maps yet to be drawn. In every smoky tavern and dockside alley, rumours bloom like bruises. There's talk of a captain with dark eyes and imperial favour, gathering ships for a voyage west farther than even Columbus dared dream. You'd heard his name whispered over dice and spilled ale. Magallanes, Portuguese-born, Spanish-backed, filled with the kind of ambition that burns men from the inside out. They say he carries a royal charter. They say he's looking for men who don't ask questions. He never had many. That morning, your fingers still smelled faintly of ash from the fireplace you slept beside. The baker had caught you. No bread, just the warmth. Just 5 minutes of pretending you were something more than marrow and dust. You left with the crust of a bruised apple and a new welt across your cheek. The docks called to you like a cathedral, not for prayer, but for forgetting. Men swarmed the wharf like ants over a carcass, some wrapped in fine coats, gesturing with rings that caught the sun, others with hollow cheeks, barefoot, their last belongings tied in cloth, or tucked into shirt seams. No one looked at one another too long. You knew that look. It was the look of men trying not to remember the faces they'd left behind. The ship you chose was called Trinidad. Her hull bore the scars of old voyages, patched timbers, rusted nails, a figurehead worn faceless by wind. But she stood proud, or perhaps defiant. A thing that refused to rot just yet. The sailor waved you aboard with a sneer and a nod. You crossed the gangplank, each creak beneath your feet, like a bell tolling for your old life. The smell hit you first. Pitch and tar, dried fish, sweat ground into canvas, and something else. Something beneath it all, like the scent of fear that had been stored too long in damp linen. The deck was a place of motion, even in stillness. Men heaved barrels into the hold, cursed in languages you didn't know, hoisted ropes that sang under tension. Above you, the sails rustled like the breath of something alive. You didn't know what half the ropes did, but you'd learn, or you'd fall. The sea didn't allow for hesitation. You were handed a piece of chalk, and a mark was drawn on your wrist. That was it. You belonged to the voyage now, to the captain, to the keel, and the mast, and the mercy of wind. There was no contract, no oath, only the weight of the ocean pressing at your ribs. Below deck, the air thickened. Hammocks swung like quiet pendulums. Rats scurried in the corners. A boy not much older than 16 lay curled beside a crate, his eyes wide open, unblinking. You asked his name. He said nothing, just clutched a locket and turned away. You would learn later he'd been pressed into service from a poorhouse. His mother hadn't known he was gone. Night came fast over the harbour, like ink spilling from the sky. The captain had not yet spoken to you. You'd seen his shape, a tall figure cloaked in silence and velvet, walking the deck like a man made from maps and marble. Men said he rarely smiled, that he'd already buried 2 brothers to the sea and meant to conquer it in their place. You stood by the railing, watching the last light curl over the city's edge. Bells rang out in the distance, vespers from the chapel, or a warning from the harbour tower. Either way, no one listened. The ship moaned as the tide pulled her outward, tugging at the ropes like a mother dragging her child away from a fire. You closed your eyes and tried to remember the feel of grass under your feet, but it was gone. There was only rope and wood and stars now. You do not sleep that night. You lie in your hammock, swaying with the swell, the breath of 50 other men thick around you. Someone sobs quietly. Someone else sings. You stare at the planks above your face and think about how thin they are, just inches between your body and the great black sea. In the dark, someone whispers a prayer in Latin. You do not answer, but somewhere, in the deep coil of your belly, a word stirs. Not hope, not fear, something older than both. The word is beginning, and beginnings, are the softest part of a nightmare. The sea at dawn was not blue. It was silver, the kind of silver found on old coins or the edges of forgotten mirrors. It shimmered like a secret whispered through a cracked door. Above, the sky peeled open in streaks of pale fire, and for a moment, the world looked clean, unwritten. You stood at the bow of the ship, your hands curled around the rough rail, watching the horizon retreat like a tide of memory. This was your first full day at sea. The land behind you had vanished in the night, swallowed by fog and time. No bells rang now. No smoke curled from chimneys. Only gulls circled the masts, crying like children who had lost their mother in a crowd. Soon, even they would leave you, too far from shore, too far from mercy. The wind had a voice here. It pulled at your hair like a curious sibling, whistled through the ropes, made the sails swell and shudder like lungs, learning to breathe. The ship creaked and shifted beneath your feet, not like a floor but like a thing alive, restless, dreaming in wood. You felt it in your bones. Every plank, every sway, every sigh of the waves. You would never walk steady again. The officers barked orders in Spanish and Portuguese. You understood little, but you followed the tone, the pointing fingers, the sharp gestures. You were handed a coil of rope as thick as your wrist and shown how to lash it, loop it, pull it tight. Your hands, soft from hunger and ash, burned raw in minutes. By noon your palms looked like old parchment, cracked and streaked with red. There was no time to pity yourself. A man with a nose like a crooked hook and a scar across his cheek showed you how to haul sail. He cursed like a poet, his words winding through the air like smoke. When you got it wrong, he cuffed you. When you got it right, he spat and moved on. That was praise enough. You learned quickly that there was no room on this ship for softness. Not in muscle, not in thought. There were too many ways to die, and not enough ways to be remembered. Meals came in metal bowls, salted fish, dry biscuit, water that already tasted of wood and mildew. You ate it with your fingers. No one spoke while eating. Words were precious things, and you learned to save them. At the stern, the captain stood alone, hands clasped behind his back. His cloak billowed in the wind, dark as oil. He did not speak to the crew, not yet, but his presence was heavy, like the pressure before a storm. The men lowered their eyes when he passed. Even the bosun straightened his spine. You saw him once in profile, sharp nose, hard eyes, lips tight as a sealed letter. A man not made for doubt. A man who stared at the horizon not to dream, but to conquer. You turned away quickly. You didn't want to be noticed. Not by him. Below deck, the ship grew narrow and dark. The hammock swung in rhythm with the waves. Barrels of grain and salted meat lined the walls. A rat watched you from atop a sack of flour, unmoving. You stared back until it blinked and vanished. There was a boy beside you, no more than 14. His name was Mateo. He spoke little, but his eyes were wide with questions. You shared your biscuit with him. He nodded in thanks. That was enough to make you feel human. At dusk, you were taught knots. You never imagined how many ways rope could twist, fold, hold, bowline, clove hitch, reef knot. Each one had its purpose, its story. The old sailor with the scar showed you again and again, until your fingers remembered better than your mind. Rope was language now, and every knot you tied meant survival. That night, you climbed the rigging for the first time. The sky stretched above you like black silk stitched with stars. The wind caught in your sleeves. The mast trembled like a thing about to wake. You paused halfway up and looked down. The deck was small, smaller than you thought. Just a floating patch of wood between two infinities. The sky and the sea. And the sea moved differently now. Not like water in a bucket, not like rivers or wells. It moved like skin, shifting, pulsing, stretching to some secret rhythm. You saw it, the way the waves rolled over one another, the sheen of moonlight on their backs. The ocean wasn't a thing. It was a being, and you were riding on its spine. The wind whispered through the ropes. You heard words in it, though none you knew. Perhaps they belonged to the men who had sailed before, or to those who never returned. Perhaps they were meant for you. You climbed higher, until the crow's nest cradled you in its narrow circle of wood. You looked out and saw only water. Endless, sleepless water. The stars above and their reflections below, and for the first time since stepping aboard, you felt small enough to vanish. Not in fear, not in shame, but in awe. The sea had no edge, and neither did the sky. You were somewhere between the two now, suspended, unseen, forgotten by the world that fed on names and boundaries. You closed your eyes and let the ship rock you. You did not sleep, but you dreamed, not of home, but of movement, of water, of sails full of breath, of the deep groan of the hull as it carried you farther from the world you knew and deeper into the skin of something ancient. In the distance, a gull cried once more, then vanished. The sea kept no clock, and the voyage had only just begun. The days melted together like wax under a slow-burning candle. The light changed, but time did not move. Each dawn was a quiet invasion of grey over grey sky above, sea below, and the pale ghosts of clouds drifting like the breath of drowned men. You stopped counting mornings. It became easier to mark time by pain. The sting in your shoulders, the raw burn on your palms, the hollow ache behind your ribs. Your skin darkened. Not the bronze of leisure, but the cracked leather of those who never leave the sun. You felt it stretch across your bones like sailcloth pulled too tight. The salt dried on your cheeks where sweat had fallen. Your lips split and scabbed, only to split again. Each time you licked them, they tasted like a blade had passed through. The officers said this was the shaping, that men had to be reshaped to fit the sea, but you wondered how much would be carved away before anything fit. You no longer walked with the proud posture of land. Here, every surface pitched and rolled. Your knees bent without thinking, your arms always ready to grip. You slept not for comfort, but to keep madness from sinking into the gaps. And you were always thirsty. Not the kind of thirst quenched by water, but the deeper kind, the thirst for stillness, for green, for shade. The barrels were rationed carefully, each man given a cup, morning and evening. You sipped it like a thief. Even then, it tasted of wood and rust. Sometimes it was yellow, sometimes it had things floating in it. But you drank. A man who did not drink would not live. The food, if it could be called that, had begun to sour. The fish was hard. The bread, older than the voyage. Some nights you closed your eyes and imagined ripe figs, warm cheese, the soft crumble of fresh bread, torn by hand. You remembered the smell of stewed onions from the street vendor back in Seville, but that smell had long since left your skin. The only smell now was salt, sweat, and always the pitch. Mateo, the boy who slept in the hammock beside you, had taken to silence. He used to hum, under his breath, little bits of melody with no beginning or end. Now he said nothing. His eyes looked too wide for his face, as if he were shrinking inward. One night he murmured something about his sister, a promise to return with gold. Then he fell asleep, clutching a piece of rope like it might carry him home. You tried to speak to him the next morning, but he only stared past you, lips moving with no sound. You didn't press him. Everyone was vanishing in their own way. You found yourself speaking less too. The ship made enough noise to fill the silence. The rigging creaked. The sails flapped. The waves slapped the hull like a slow heartbeat. Men coughed. Someone always coughed. There was a sailor named Gregorio who coughed so hard you thought his ribs would snap. The sound echoed through the lower deck at night, like something clawing the wood. No one offered help. There was nothing to give. Work continued without pause. You mended sails with needle and gut-string, fingers bleeding into the cloth. You scrubbed the deck on your knees until splinters lodged in your skin like thorns. You learned to climb the rigging in the dark, to trust your feet and the wind, and when the officers gave orders, you obeyed, not out of respect, but because disobedience meant punishment, and punishment meant pain. One man disobeyed. He had fallen asleep at the watch. His name was Pedro, broad-shouldered, slow to speak, always smiling until they tied his hands to the mast, and whipped him until the smile left. You counted the lashes because you couldn't look away. 12, then 13, then 20. The blood dripped in quiet arcs, soaking the planks below. No one helped him stand. He crawled back to his hammock on his own. You saw him staring at the floor later, whispering the word land like a prayer. But there was no land, only more sea. The ocean had turned darker, not just in color, but in feeling. The waves were taller now, the wind sharper. Even the gulls were gone. Some said they were in the open ocean now, the Mar Pacifico, though the name rang false in your ears. There was nothing peaceful about this place. At night, you dreamed of drowning, not in water, but in silence. You dreamed of a deck with no voices, a ship that creaked, but never moved. You saw your own face in the waves, and did not recognize it. One evening, as the sun bled red across the sky, you climbed to the stern and stood beside the railing, watching the ship's wake trail behind like a wound. You could not see land, not even the shape of it in the distance, just water folding into water, and the sound of your own breath. You remembered the words of a farmer you once met, who said that land held memory, but the sea erased it, that here, even names dissolved. You touched your chest, as if to feel your name still written beneath the skin, but all you felt was salt. Salt in your mouth, salt on your hands, salt in your blood, and still you did not look back, because there was nothing left behind, and nothing ahead but the sea. The sky broke without warning. At first, it was only a shift, a hush too deep to be natural, as if the ocean had drawn in a long breath. The wind that had once been constant and guiding fell silent, and the sails drooped like wilted petals. You stood on the deck with a coil of rope in your hands, watching the clouds gather like bruises above the mast. The color of the world turned, not grey, not black, but a sickly bleeding yellow, the color of oil and fevered eyes. Then came the sound. Low at first, like a moan beneath the floorboards of a rotting house. It rose with startling speed, growing into a roar that swallowed all other noise. You saw birds, black specks far off, racing inland with frantic wings. You envied them in that moment. Birds could flee. You could not. The captain barked commands, sharp and swift, his voice cutting through the rising chaos. Men scrambled. Hands flew across ropes. Sails were reefed, stowed, twisted shut. But the storm was already there, as if it had been waiting just beyond the veil of sky for the right hour to strike. You ran to the mainmast, fingers burning as you worked the knots you'd rehearsed in sunlit calm. Now they were tests of life, of whether your hands remembered what your mind could not in panic. Rain lashed you in sheets, not droplets. It was warm, then suddenly cold, and it carried with it the stench of deep, dead things. The sea, which had swayed like breath before, began to gnash its teeth. Waves rose like monsters, not rolling, but rearing, full of muscle and wrath. One struck the side of the ship with such violence you felt your knees buckle, your ribs shudder. The ship groaned, deep and low, like it knew it might not survive. Somewhere behind you a man screamed. Then another. The deck had become a battlefield. Barrels rolled loose. A mast splintered at the top, sending a yardarm crashing to the boards with a splintering crack that sounded like a neck snapping. You dove to the side just before it landed. The boy wasn't fast enough. You heard his skull meet wood. You didn't look. You couldn't look. The wind screamed now, Not like air, but like a living thing, full of fury, full of voices. It tore at your clothes, your skin, your thoughts. It lifted the sails in wild arcs, snapped lines, rattled shutters below deck. You saw men crawling across the planks like ants, holding fast to anything they could. You were ordered to the bow. You ran, stumbling as the ship pitched, feet slipping on water and blood. You reached the rail and tied yourself to the post. A line around your waist, your arm through the loop. The knot had to hold. If it didn't, the sea would take you and never give you back. Lightning ripped the sky open. For a breathless instant, the ship was cast in white fire. Every line of the rigging, every nail, every soul aboard revealed in skeletal silhouette. The sea flashed too, showing its vastness, its contempt. Then the thunder hit. It didn't crash. It exploded. The world became noise. Your teeth rattled. Your ears rang. You gripped the rope and closed your eyes. The ship rose on the back of a wave like a rag doll lifted by a cruel child. For one impossible second, you felt the weightlessness of flight, the kind that comes before a fall. Then the drop. The ship slammed into the trough with a shudder that threw men across the deck like dice. You heard something snap. Maybe a bone. Maybe a beam. The night dragged on. There was no moon. Only chaos. Only water. Only the sound of men calling out to gods they'd forgotten. One whispered, Ave Marias. Another cried for his mother. Someone shouted for land, over and over, as if saying it enough would make it appear. You stayed silent. You had no words left. The rain soaked you through. Not even your bones felt dry. Your hands bled from rope burns. Your mouth tasted of bile and salt and fear, and yet you held on. You thought of the baker's fire, of green grass, of warm bread and your father's coat. You clung to those images as if they were lifelines. And still, the storm would not end. When at last it broke, not with a sigh, but with a sudden slackening, the sea didn't calm. It simply fell still. The wind died. The rain faded. The clouds parted like torn cloth. And above you, the stars blinked down, indifferent. The ship floated in silence. Sails hung in tatters. The deck was littered with debris, with limbs, with men who would not rise again. Water sloshed below your boots, stained dark. Someone coughed behind you, a wet, rattling sound. Another man sobbed into his hands. The captain stood, back straight, his cloak torn and dripping, staring at the horizon as if it owed him something. You untied yourself slowly, hands trembling. You were no longer sure of your legs. They moved only because they had to. You stepped over the boy whose skull had cracked. His eyes were open, but he saw nothing. You thought you might be sick. Instead, you knelt beside a shattered barrel and drank from a puddle, collected in its hollow. It tasted of salt and old rum. It tasted of survival. When you lay in your hammock later, soaked and shaking, you didn't sleep. You stared at the beams above and listened to the groaning of the ship, to the moans of the wounded, to the quiet drip of water from the seams. The storm had passed, but it had taken something with it. Something invisible, something you would never get back. You were no longer afraid of dying, only of surviving. The storm left behind a silence so complete it felt unnatural. It wasn't peace, not the hush of mourning or the calm of prayer, but a strange, hollow stillness, as if the ship had slipped sideways into some place where sound dared not linger. The waves, once monstrous, now barely stirred, rocking the vessel with the gentleness of regret. The sails hung limp, their torn edges fluttering like wounded wings. Somewhere a rope swung rhythmically against a mast. Tap, 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 the only sound brave enough to break the silence. You stood at the railing, fingers stiff from the storm, your boots still wet inside. The sea shimmered in the early light, deceptively serene, but you knew what it hid. You knew what it had taken. There was one less man aboard. You didn't see him fall. No one did. In the chaos of rain and shouting and sails tearing from their seams, he had vanished. A man named Jacinto, a deckhand with a crooked smile and a habit of humming songs from his village in Galicia. He had a deep scar down one wrist, a story no one asked him to tell. He'd shared a crust of bread with you once, torn in silence. That was all. That was enough to remember him by. The morning roll call was quiet. The officers said nothing. There was no prayer, no bell, no words spoken into the wind, just a quick scribble in the ledger. One less bowl at the ration line. The sea had taken its due. You walked the deck in slow, aimless circles, as if searching for something that could not be returned. Bits of rope still lay coiled in puddles. A shattered barrel listed near the forecastle, leaking molasses. The air smelled of damp wood and blood and rot. Above, gulls circled again. They had returned now that the sky was tame. One landed on the rail beside you. Its eyes were black and gleaming. It stared at you without blinking. You thought. For a moment it looked like Jacinto. You looked away before the thought could settle. Below deck, the mood was brittle. Men sat in silence, backs against barrels, staring into the dim lantern light like monks in a catacomb. Someone was humming, not Jacinto, but another voice, softer, more broken. Mateo sat near the bulkhead, hugging his knees. His lips moved, repeating something under his breath. You leaned closer and heard it. He didn't scream. You froze. Mateo looked up at you, his face pale, his eyes wide. Jacinto. He didn't scream, he whispered. He just fell, like he meant to. You wanted to tell him it wasn't true. That the sea had pulled him without mercy. That no man would walk willingly into the storm. But your mouth was dry. And you remembered too well how the waves looked that night. Not wild, but inviting. Like a door left ajar. That afternoon, the captain addressed the crew. It was brief. He stood on the quarterdeck, flanked by 2 officers, his cloak clean and pressed, his beard combed as though nothing had happened. "We proceed west," he said. "This is the price of discovery." Then he turned and walked away. That was all. No one cheered. No one nodded. The crew dispersed like leaves blown apart by wind. The moment did not end. It simply dissolved. You went back to work. There was always work. The storm had frayed more than rope and wood. The ship herself seemed bruised, aching in her joints. You helped patch the sails, stitching canvas by lantern light, the needle biting your thumb more times than you could count. You tied new lines, hauled buckets of water from the hold, scrubbed the deck until your back screamed. It was better than stillness. Stillness meant remembering. That night, you climbed into your hammock, slowly. The boards beneath creaked with every movement. But it was not the ship that disturbed you. It was the emptiness around you. Jacinto's hammock still hung nearby, untouched. No one had taken it down. It swayed slightly. You told yourself it was only the ship's motion, only the rhythm of the waves. You turned to the wall, tucked your hands beneath your head, and listened to the wood breathe. Later, in that strange place between waking and sleep, you saw him, standing at the bow, looking out at nothing. His hair wet, his clothes torn, but his face calm, peaceful, even. You didn't call out to him. You didn't ask why. When you awoke, the sun had not yet risen, but the world had changed again. Subtly, like a stitch unraveling. No jokes passed between sailors. No games, no whispered songs. Only tasks. Orders. The smell of tar and sweat and mildew. You wiped down the same rope twice, forgetting you had done it already. Your hands moved on their own. That evening, someone found a scrap of cloth caught in the railing. Torn linen, stained red. No one claimed it. It was tossed overboard without ceremony. The water accepted it without a sound. The next night, someone sobbed below deck. Not loud, just enough to make you still. You recognized the voice, but said nothing. You curled your knees to your chest and closed your eyes. You were beginning to understand something. This was not a voyage. It was a slow burial, and the sea did not bury with stone or soil. It buried in forgetting, in silence, in names that vanished between the waves. The hunger was not sudden. It arrived the way mildew creeps into cloth, quietly, invisibly, until one morning you wake, and the whole world smells sour. It began with smaller portions, a half scoop of rice instead of a full one, fewer beans. Then the rice disappeared. Then the beans. The bread was next. What remained of it dry as ash. Each piece harder than the last. Each bite loud between your teeth, like biting stone. You chewed slowly as if that would make it last longer. It didn't. You learned to savor the moment before eating more than the eating itself. That fragile anticipation of texture, of salt, of warmth. But warmth was a memory now. Everything served was cold, or lukewarm if you were lucky. The biscuits, flat, round, grey as driftwood, had begun to come alive. At first, you thought it was your eyes playing tricks. A faint movement in the grain, a twitch beneath the surface, but then you split one open and saw them. Worms, pale and fat, curled like question marks in the centre of your supper. The man beside you laughed, not from amusement, but something closer to despair. He said they were better than nothing. More protein. You ate it. You told yourself they tasted like almonds. They did not. They tasted like rotten fear. You stopped smelling your food. The officers still ate in their own quarters. No one spoke of what they had, but the smells wafted out through the narrow stairwell at night. Garlic, fat, the faint, sweet burn of wine. You caught that scent once while hauling a bucket of rainwater, and nearly wept, not from jealousy, but from remembering your mother's stew, lentils, cumin. The way she'd let the pot simmer all day. You had been a child then, and ungrateful. You would have given your teeth for one spoonful now. The dreams changed. No longer of land or lovers, but of meals, boiled potatoes, fresh butter, warm bread torn from the oven and dipped in oil. You dreamed of roast chicken and green olives, of sweet figs and honey. You dreamed of chewing. And then you awoke, biting your own hand. The taste of blood lingered on your tongue. Matteo had grown quieter still. He picked at his food with trembling fingers. You saw him once scrape the mold from a crust with a broken nail, then eat the rest in 2 bites. You asked him if he was all right. He didn't answer. He just pointed toward the captain's cabin, then held a finger to his lips. That was the first time you noticed the hate. It wasn't loud. It didn't scream or curse. It simmered beneath the skin, behind the eyes. The kind of hate that comes from injustice, not injury. You saw it in the way men looked at their officers now, not with fear, but with a slow, building rage. They were hungry. And they were watching. A man named Leon, tall and sharp-faced, began to keep count out loud at first, then on the wall behind his hammock. Not days, not meals, just the number of men who had stopped eating. Some from death, some from despair, others still alive, but shrinking, their bodies folding inward like paper set aflame from the inside. Leon said the number would keep rising. No one argued. You began to drink more water, not because it helped, but because it filled the space. Rainwater was gathered from tarps, strung across the deck, filtered through cloth, and stored in cracked barrels. It tasted like wet leather, sometimes worse. But you drank. You drank to stop the gnawing. You drank to sleep. You tried boiling your belt once. You weren't alone. A few of you gathered in the hold with an iron pot, some water, a bit of old rope, and a strip of leather torn from your own waist. The broth smelled of nothing. It looked like ink. You swallowed it anyway. And in the darkness, you all laughed. Not joyously, but with the brittle relief of those who had already passed the edge of shame. You learned to stop looking at food as food. It became something else. A shape beside you. A figure, a whispering thing. Hunger wasn't just a lack anymore. It was a presence. It followed you up the ladder, coiled around your ankles as you worked the sails. It whispered in your ear as you leaned over the railing, watching for fish that never came. It sat beside you as you lay in your hammock, counting the holes in the ceiling planks. One night, a man screamed. You rushed above deck to find him crouched over a barrel, chewing something red. They pulled him back too late. It was the rat they'd caught earlier. He hadn't even cooked it. Just tore into it with his teeth, snarling like a dog. They threw him in the brig. He laughed the whole way down the stairs. You tried not to think about him when your stomach tightened. Instead, you thought of the old stories of sailors who had eaten their shoes, their belts, each other. You told yourself you were not there, not yet. But the line was close, and thinner than you'd thought. You caught yourself staring at Leon's arm as he slept. You hated yourself for it. You closed your eyes and whispered a prayer you hadn't spoken in years. Not for deliverance, but for forgetfulness. The sea, at least, was constant. It offered no food, no mercy, no change. Only salt, only sway, only the sound of rope groaning and boards creaking, and stomachs curling inward like fists. You swallowed nothing, and told yourself it was enough. And when morning came, you broke your biscuit in half, and didn't even check for worms. You just ate. Because hate, you'd learned could keep you warm. And hunger could teach you how to disappear. Discipline returned like a blade drawn too slowly. You felt it in the shift of footsteps, in the way the officers stood taller, voices sharper, eyes scanning every motion with suspicion. The storm had shaken the ship, but hunger was unraveling it. And when men fray, command must harden. That was the logic of the sea. You learned it the morning Pedro stole the sugar. It wasn't much, a single spoonful, hidden in the fold of his shirt, his hands shaking so badly that he spilled some before he could even taste it. You saw it before the others did, the way he crouched near the quartermaster's chest, fingers fumbling, breath caught in his throat like a swallowed word. Then the shout came, and 2 officers grabbed him by the collar. Pedro didn't struggle. He only wept. They tied him to the mainmast. You were made to watch. The bosun counted each stroke aloud, his voice flat as the sea. 20 lashes. The whip cracked like breaking bones, each strike blooming red across Pedro's back, his shirt torn, then stripped away entirely. You watched skin split. You watched blood run. You watched his knees buckle, and his mouth open to scream. But no sound came. By the 13th lash, he was unconscious. But the whip did not stop. You stood with the others, silent. Not because you didn't care, but because this too was survival. When it ended, they cut him loose. He crumpled to the deck, a heap of blood and cloth. No one helped him. That was the rule now. The line had been drawn. Afterward, the captain addressed the crew from the quarterdeck. His voice was calm, almost soft. "There are those among you who forget," he said, "that this is not a democracy. This ship sails by order, not desire. Hunger is no excuse. Desperation is no defense. Disobedience is death." Then he stepped down, his boots clicking against the planks, the scent of orange oil still lingering on his gloves. The message was clear. You were not equal here. Not in hunger, not in suffering, not in From that day forward, the ship was split, not into officers and crew, but into those who were watched, and those who watched them. Trust had vanished. Eyes lingered too long. Conversations ended when others approached. You saw a man mark his own bread with charcoal, to ensure it wasn't taken. You saw another sleep with a rope wrapped around his waist, tied to the food chest. And Mateo changed. He no longer clung to your side. He drifted, sat alone. His eyes darted like a cornered animal. You approached him once, asked how he was. He only looked at the horizon and whispered, "She's still hungry." You didn't ask who he meant. That night, you shared watch with a sailor named Hernando, a thick-armed man with a tattoo of a dagger inked onto his neck. He said little, but as you stood together at the railing, he broke the silence. "Won't be long now," he muttered. You asked what he meant. He didn't answer, only spat into the sea and walked away. You returned to your hammock, uneasy. In the hold, someone had etched a line into the beam above their bed, a jagged mark separating 2 sets of tallies. You didn't know who had done it, but the meaning was clear. Before and after, before the storm, before the whipping, before the hunger had turned men against one another. The boy who slept beside the beam no longer spoke. He stared at the ceiling and mouthed words that didn't exist. When you asked his name, he blinked, then looked away. You learned to speak less. Silence was safety. Even laughter, when it came, felt dangerous. Too loud, too human. One man chuckled over a filthy joke, and was met with 5 narrowed glances. He stopped mid-sentence, apologized, returned to scrubbing the deck. There was no joy now, only routine. Wake, haul, scrub, eat, sleep, repeat. And beneath it all, the growing sense that something inside the ship had changed. Not just among the crew, but in the ship itself. The timbers groaned with a darker note. The sails flapped like they were trying to escape. Even the water lapping against the hull sounded colder, more cruel. One morning, you found a rope cut clean in the middle, frayed as if by blade. You reported it. The bosun said nothing, only narrowed his eyes. That night, he searched the hammocks. They found a knife beneath a pillow. No one claimed it. The next day, a third of the crew were lashed. Not with whips, but with rope ends, heavy and wet. The bruises bloomed purple. Some bled, some cried. Most just took it with clenched jaws. Afterward, the captain said it was a reminder. a reminder of who held the line. But that line was wearing thin. You felt it in every step, every order, every silence. The space between command and rebellion had shrunk to a thread, fraying with every skipped meal, every missed sunrise. And still, the sea stretched on, endless, impartial, watching. You knew the storm outside had passed. But the storm inside, within the hull, within the men, had only just begun, and the ship was sailing straight into its eye. Night arrived without ceremony. No stars, no moon. Just a low, formless dark that pressed against the ship like a wet cloth. Even the sea had quieted, though not peacefully, more like a predator lying in wait. Breath held, eyes open, the sails barely moved, the ropes hung slack, and still the air refused to rest. You walked the deck in silence, not for duty, but because sleep had abandoned you, as it had most men. Below, the hammock swayed with restless bodies, twisted blankets, muffled cries. Up here, at least, you could breathe, could feel the cold sting your skin and remind you were still something solid. Then you saw it. The sail. Someone had scrawled words across it in charcoal. Not orders, not marks of measurement, but a prayer. You didn't recognize all of it. Latin, maybe, or Portuguese. The writing trailed across the canvas in a crooked line, ending in a smeared handprint, blood, dried, cracked, brown as rust. You touched the cloth. It was still damp from the night air. No one spoke of it the next day, but the whispers started, that the ship was cursed, that the storm had cracked something deeper than wood, that the sea no longer wanted them. Some laughed, others did not. You were among the latter. That evening, the priest stopped eating. Father Esteban, a thin man with parchment skin and fingers stained from ink and oil. He'd once held sermons on deck, Sundays marked by muttered prayer and the sour tang of incense burning in a rusted pot. Now he sat cross-legged near the stern facing the sea, lips moving soundlessly. You passed him once and caught a word. Leviathan. Another sailor said he'd been murmuring the names of the dead, not just those lost to storm and sickness, but names no one had spoken. Names that didn't belong to this voyage. You watched him one night drag his finger across the deck, tracing invisible lines, a map no one else could read. He smiled at you when he noticed your stare, and you could not smile back. That night, sleep came like a thief, sudden and cold. You dreamed of hills. Not green ones, not real ones, but hills that seemed made of velvet and ash. You walked them barefoot, the earth warm beneath you, until you found a door standing alone in the grass. You opened it. Inside was your mother. She was cooking lentils, humming a tune you hadn't heard in years. She turned to you, smiled, and said something, but no sound came. You woke with tears on your cheeks. You weren't alone. Amasio sat nearby, shivering, his face pale, his hands clutched around the wooden cross he wore on a string. You asked if he'd slept. He shook his head. I heard singing, he whispered. You didn't, but others said the same the next morning, that there'd been voices during the night. High, mournful, distant. One man claimed they came from the water, another from the sails, a third from inside the ship itself, as though the planks had begun to speak. You listened that next night. You heard only the creak of rope, the slap of water, a rat scuttling across a beam, but you prayed anyway. Not the words you were taught as a child, not the hymns sung in stone churches or muttered over bread. No, this was different. No verses, no saints, just a whisper into the black. You said your name, just one. You said you were still here. You asked to remain. The following morning, Father Esteban was gone. His robes were found neatly folded at the stern, his cross placed atop them, untouched by dew. No footprints. No sign of struggle, just a hollow in the air where he had once been. They said he had walked into the sea. You did not disagree. The captain made no announcement. The officers searched nothing. The prayers stopped, but the dreams continued. They became brighter, sharper, too vivid to bear. You dreamed of golden coins in your mouth, of your teeth crumbling into sand. You dreamed of your sister calling your name from beneath the planks, her voice full of water. And still, you tied knots with trembling fingers. You hauled canvas with cracked palms. You watched the horizon like a condemned man watches the gallows. One evening, you found a sliver of paper in your coat, a page torn from a Bible, damp, faded. It read, "And he maketh a storm a calm, so that the waves thereof are still." You laughed, not loudly, but enough to scare yourself. That night, men began to wear talismans, scraps of fabric knotted around wrists, coins sewn into shirt collars. One man carved symbols into the wood beside his bed, not crosses, but older signs, spirals, eyes, teeth. You didn't stop him. No one did. The line between faith and fear had blurred now, between dreams and madness, between the prayers whispered into the wind, and the answers the sea had begun to whisper back. The cry came at dawn, a single word, sharp and bright, like sunlight striking steel. Land. You heard it before you saw it. The shout tore through the morning fog, louder than any bell. You sprang from your hammock, heart thundering, knees shaking from sleep. Others moved too, scrambling from below deck like rats from a flooded cellar, faces wide with disbelief, mouths already forming prayers or laughter or both. You reached the deck just as a wave of bodies surged toward the starboard rail. Men jostled, leaned over the edge, squinting against the glare. The sun was rising, red and swollen like a bloodshot eye, and there, just beyond the mist, was the shape, dark, jagged, still, a piece of the world not made of water. Your breath caught. Your fingers gripped the railing hard enough to splinter. For weeks you had known only the sea, endless and cruel, and now, land, real land. You could almost smell it, dirt, leaves, warmth. You could almost hear birdsong. Matteo stood beside you, trembling. "I told you," he whispered. "She's done testing us." You didn't ask who she was. Voices rose, cheers, claps on the back, songs half remembered. One man dropped to his knees and kissed the deck. Another crossed himself 3 times and wept openly. Even the officers allowed themselves to smile. Not the captain, he only watched, silent, eyes unreadable. Hands folded behind his back, the ship adjusted course. The sails were tightened. The rudder creaked. You tasted joy for the first time in days. It was bitter. The shape in the mist grew clearer. It rose like the spine of a sleeping beast, arched and black, touched by golden light. You strained your eyes, searching for trees, for cliffs, for any sign of life. You saw none, but you didn't care. Land was land, and then it was gone. At first, you thought it was the fog, then a trick of the light, but it faded, slowly and completely, like ink washing from a page. The shape dissolved into mist, into shadow, into nothing. Your voice caught in your throat. You rubbed your eyes, blinked hard. It wasn't there. It had never been there. Someone screamed. Others cursed, loudly, like men betrayed. Matteo fell to his knees. "No," he said. "No, no, no." The captain spoke then. Only one word. "Back." The crew obeyed, but not with order, with dread. Ropes were slackened. Sails shifted. The ship turned, circling the place where the land had been. Nothing. Just open water. Just fog, and the low murmur of men, realizing what had happened. A mirage. A cruel trick of light and sea. The kind sailors spoke of only when they returned home, drunk and shaking, clutching rosaries with white-knuckled hands. You didn't speak. You couldn't. Not for the rest of the day. The silence on deck was deeper than before. Not empty, but full of something worse. Disappointment, like rot in the belly. Hope turned sour. You noticed then how thin the men had become. Skin stretched over bone, eyes sunken like hollow coins. The cheering had taken energy they didn't have. Now they slumped, hunched and wordless, leaning against crates, hands shaking as they held their bowls at supper. Most didn't eat. You tried. You chewed a biscuit so slowly it turned to paste, swallowing without tasting. That night, someone disappeared. You didn't hear it happen. You only noticed the empty hammock. It belonged to a man named Luis. Quiet, reliable, once a carpenter's apprentice. He'd mended the barrels in the hold, always humming under his breath. That morning, his tools were still neatly arranged. His boots still stood by his bedding, but he was gone. No one had seen him. No one had heard a splash. And yet, no man had left the ship. You stood at the rail that evening, staring into the black water, trying to understand how someone could vanish without a sound. The sea gave no answers, only its steady breath, its wide silence, its dark promise. Matteo joined you, his arms folded tight. He saw it too, he whispered. That land. He believed in it. You nodded. So had you. So had all of you. Above, the sky was clear. Stars blinked into place, cold and ancient. The constellations felt further away now, smaller, less like guides, and more like decorations in a room no one remembered. Below, the sea churned softly, relentless. You wondered what it had cost to imagine that land, that one glimpse of safety, of stillness. Was it better to have believed, even if it wasn't real, or had it broken something that could not be repaired? That night, as you lay in your hammock, you tried to summon the image again. The shape on the horizon, the shore, the trees. You couldn't. It had already begun to fade, like a dream you never wanted to wake from. The sickness arrived in silence, like a thief with a soft step. No trumpet of blood, no loud collapse. Just a man, turning away from his meal one morning, hand trembling too much to hold his spoon. The cook, a short, thick-fingered man named Alonso, was the first. You heard the vomiting through the hatch before anyone said the word. He coughed until his ribs cracked. When they brought him above deck for air, he couldn't stand. He was dead by nightfall. His body was wrapped in a sailcloth and sewn shut with pitch thread. They gave him no rights. The captain muttered a prayer no one heard, and the body slid into the water with barely a splash. You watched the sea take him quietly, without fanfare. The gulls circled once, then vanished. The next morning, the boy fell ill. Not Matteo, though you kept watching him now. Always. But another. Young. Freckled. Too pale. You didn't know his name. He shook as he climbed the rigging, then stopped halfway and vomited down onto the deck. A sailor below screamed. They both went below deck. The boy never came up again. And then the priest. Or what remained of him. Father Esteban had returned, or so the whispers said. He was found near the stern, barefoot, muttering verses with words that tangled and slipped away. His robe was gone. His feet were cut and blistered. When the officers tried to bring him in, he bit one on the wrist. They tied him to a beam in the hold. No one went near. You caught a glimpse of him once, in the lantern light. Eyes wide, lips blackened. He stared at you as if he could see through your skin. The fever didn't strike like lightning. It seeped. It curled itself into the bones, the belly, the tongue. It began with cold sweats. Then the gums bled. Then the teeth loosened, one by one. You heard a man sob as he pulled his own molar free with a cloth-wrapped hand. Another man died in his hammock, bleeding from the ears. They didn't bury him. There was no time. You were told to keep working. The sails still needed repair. The deck needed scrubbing. The barrels had to be rotated to prevent rot. You hauled and lifted and tied knots with raw fingers, watching your crewmates through the corner of your eye. Who was coughing? Who was limping? Who was staring too long at nothing? You learnt to tell the signs. The far-off look. The twitching hands. The way a man forgot the words for simple things. You kept your mouth closed. One evening they brought up another body. He was stitched into canvas. As always, the final thread pierced the nose. A sailor named Tomas told you why. To make sure the man was truly dead. If he flinched, they stopped. If not, he was gone. This one did not flinch. The sea took him without comment. You lay awake at night now, listening, not for footsteps, but for breath, for the wheeze in a man's chest, for the silence that meant you would find another empty hammock by morning. Matteo still spoke to you, but his voice was softer, strained. They say it's the food, he whispered one night. They say it's in the biscuits. You didn't answer, because you had eaten them too. A man beside you carved tally marks into the wood above his bed, one for each who died. There were 12 by week's end. You didn't know his name either, but you prayed he would not carve yours. The captain ordered quarantine, but there was nowhere to go. The sick were moved to the forward hold. You were told not to visit. Some did. A brother, a friend, a debt owed. Some didn't return. The hold began to stink, not of sweat or rot, but of despair. You passed it with your nose covered, eyes forward, listening to the moans rising from the dark. A sailor jumped overboard that night. He didn't scream. He just walked to the edge, hands shaking, and stepped off. No one called for rescue. No one threw rope. You remembered the priest's prayer, the one scrawled on the sail in charcoal and blood. You remembered the way the fever took the cook, the boy, the man with the broken teeth. You remembered your own dreams, now filled with water, with nails falling from your mouth, with the captain whispering your name, though his lips did not move. And you remembered the needle through the nose. A final kindness. You sat in your hammock, clutching a damp piece of cloth, wiping sweat from your brow every 10 minutes. You weren't sick. Not yet, but the air felt heavier now. It pressed on your chest, like guilt. And when you closed your eyes, you no longer dreamed of food. You dreamed of silence, of a cold sheet pulled over your face, of floating, of peace. He began to change, after the 14th burial. Not suddenly, not like a man struck by madness all at once, but slowly, the way light fades at dusk, minute by minute, until you look up and realize night has fallen. The captain, once so composed, so carved from marble, began to unravel. It started with his coat. He stopped wearing it. That heavy, royal blue garment stitched with gold thread, always pristine, always buttoned to the throat. It vanished. One morning he appeared on deck in a plain wool tunic, damp at the collar, with sleeves rolled to the elbows like any labourer. It unsettled the crew more than any storm had. Then his voice began to wither. Where once he had barked commands like a general, now he gave them in murmurs, or not at all. His officers spoke on his behalf. His lips moved, but the sound rarely followed. He watched from the quarterdeck, one hand behind his back, the other resting on the railing, always staring west, toward the edge of the world. Matteo asked you if you was ill. You didn't know, but you began to notice the rumours. Whispers passed in low voices between barrels, behind crates, beneath breath, that the maps were wrong, that the stars had changed, that the captain no longer knew where he was leading them, or if he had ever known. You watched him trace a finger across a torn chart, over and over, stopping at the same point each time, a place marked with no name, just a jagged circle drawn in ink. Others began to watch too, and with watching came doubt, and with doubt, the scent of mutiny. You caught glimpses of it in the dark, men huddled together after hours, voices hushed, backs turned. Leon, the tall sailor with a stitched brow and a voice like a cracking tree, was among them. He had become louder, sharper. His jokes landed like stones. His laughter didn't rise with the others. It broke them. "We keep sailing into nothing," he said one day, loudly enough to hear. "Maybe we should turn back, before there's no one left to hold the ropes." No one responded, but no one stopped him either. That was when you began sleeping with your knife tucked beneath your hammock, not for the sea, but for the men. A ship, you realized, was not held together by nails or rope. It was held by belief. Belief in purpose, in direction, in the man who charted its course. Without that, every plank becomes suspect. Every eye becomes a threat. The line between sailor and traitor was thinner now. You saw it on deck when two men argued over a coil of line. The younger one shoved the elder. A week ago, it would have earned a slap and a laugh. This time, it ended with blood on the wood, and both men tied to the mast for an hour. Discipline had returned, not as order, but as... The officers watched from the shadows. The captain said nothing. He hadn't spoken in 2 days. You passed him near the tiller. His eyes were rimmed red, his beard unkempt. He clutched a compass in his hand, not looking at it, just holding it like a relic. You saw him glance skyward, lips moving, not in prayer, not in command, in question. The stars above gave no answer. They no longer looked familiar. Their patterns had changed, or perhaps your memory had. You saw them now as teeth in a black mouth, waiting to bite. Below deck, the fever had slowed, not from healing, but from lack of hosts. The sick were mostly gone. Now only the restless remained. They whispered of mutiny with the tone of men discussing the weather. Calm, inevitable. You asked Matteo what he thought. "I think the captain's already gone," he said, voice soft. "He just hasn't left yet." That night, you climbed to the crow's nest alone. The wind up high was colder, cleaner. The sails stretched beneath you like the wings of a dying bird. You looked down and saw the captain still standing at the helm, unmoving, staring into the dark, a shadow with a ship beneath him. Not a leader, a figurehead, a ghost. You closed your eyes, tried to remember the sound of his voice when he first addressed you in Seville, clear, firm, like a man who had seen the world and returned to show others. That voice was gone now, swallowed by miles, by sickness, by hunger and doubt. In its place, only silence remained, the kind that deepens, day by day, until the crew begins to wonder whether the next voice they hear will be his or their own, rising up to replace him. And when that moment came, you didn't know what side you would stand on. It began just after midnight. The ship rocked gently on a windless sea, the sky above like black velvet stitched with sharp silver. Below, the crew slumbered in their hammocks, restless, twitching, murmuring in dreams, fed by hunger and dread. You had just come off watch, hands still smelling of tar and rope, when you heard it, a footstep too quick, too careful, then another. Not the heavy thud of the bosun's boots, not the languid shuffle of a half-asleep sailor. This was something else. You sat upright, listening. 3 men passed your hammock, moving toward the main ladder. One carried something wrapped in cloth. You saw it flash briefly, metal catching moonlight, a blade. You did not move. You did not speak. The air around you felt tight, like it had been sucked from the room. Others stirred too. No words, just eyes opening, breathing slowed, muscles tensed, all of you waiting for it to begin. The shouting came first. The voice on deck, Leon's voice, sharp and loud. Now, then the clash of feet, the sudden thud of struggle, the crack of bone against wood. You scrambled from your hammock, heart pounding. Men rushed past you, some to fight, some to hide. You followed up the ladder, into the dark, onto the deck, where chaos had bloomed like fire on dry grass. 3 mutineers, Leon and 2 others, one with a dagger, one with a broken oar, gripped like a club. Their target, the captain. He stood at the wheel, cloaked, in shadow, but he did not run. He did not cry out. He only stepped back, hand at his hip, eyes unreadable. One officer moved to defend him, and was struck down with the club, not fatally, but hard enough to crumple. Another reached for his sword but fumbled, blade clattering to the planks. Then, Leon reached the helm. His knife gleamed. "This ends now," he said, breath hot, eyes wild. No more silence, no more ghosts. You expected the captain to fight, but he didn't. Instead, he stared at Leon, not with anger, not with fear, but with pity. "I knew it would be you," he said. And then he moved, not like a sailor, not like a man his age should have, but fast-trained. He stepped inside Leon's reach, caught the wrist, turned it, the knife dropped. A strike to the throat, a twist of the knee. Leon collapsed, gasping. One mutineer ran. The other lunged, caught the captain's shoulder, slashed him across the arm. Blood spilled. But the captain did not fall. A sailor tackled the second mutineer from behind, dragging him down. More crew joined, those who had stood watching now choosing sides. The mutiny unraveled faster than it had begun. Within minutes, it was over. 3 men lay bound at the captain's feet. Leon, wheezing, a welt on his neck. The second, bleeding from the lip. The third, wide-eyed, shaking, pants soaked through. The rest of the crew stood in a loose ring, breathless. You among them. The captain looked out across the deck, eyes hard now, alive, chained. "You think you can take this ship?" he asked, voice steady, despite the blood on his sleeve. "You think silence means surrender?" No one answered. "You are not kings," he said. "You are not captains. You are not saviors. You are men, and men obey." Then, without ceremony, he ordered the punishment. The ship fell into motion. Ropes were fetched. The mast was cleared. No trial, no defense. Leon was the first. They tied his wrists. Loop around the beam, pulled him upright. The whip cracked once, twice, 3 times. By the 5th he screamed. By the 7th he begged. At 10 he passed out. The others received the same. No death? Not yet. But no forgiveness either. The captain left them there, tied, shuddering. You watched it all. You told yourself they deserved it. That order had been restored. That this was how ships must survive. But something inside you felt heavier now. Not guilt, but grief. Grief for what had just been proven. That even here, far from courts and cities and crowns. Power spoke the same language, pain. You returned to your hammock with blood on your mind and bile in your throat. Matteo said nothing. Neither did you. You lay down, the boards above your face dark and warped, and you understood what had truly happened. It had not been a mutiny. It had been a test. And the captain had passed, but at what cost? The silence that returned was not the silence of peace. It was the silence after violence. Thick, watchful, unfinished. You did not sleep. Not because of fear, but because you now knew something dangerous. That on this ship, justice was measured in bruises, and loyalty had a blade behind its back. You no longer knew where you were. The maps said west. The stars said otherwise. The captain said nothing at all. Each morning the crew gathered to listen, not for orders, but for clues. Scraps of language, gestures, glances, anything to reveal the direction of this ship, or the mind of the man who steered it. But there was only the wheel turning, the sails shifting, the groan of wood under endless sky. The compass spun, not wildly, just enough to sow doubt. Its needle trembled, then slowed, then turned again. You watched the navigator hold it in his palm, lips drawn tight, sweat at his brow. He tapped the case, shook it, then set it down with a muttered curse. When you asked what was wrong, he simply replied, "It doesn't know anymore." Neither did you. The sky changed. Clouds passed in strange shapes, long tendrils that reached like fingers across the horizon. The moon rose in the wrong place. The air grew thick, heavy, pressing at your lungs like damp cloth. Even the color of the sea changed, from blue to green to a shade of grey that looked like ash dissolved in water. You asked another sailor how long it had been since the last sight of land. He didn't answer. He only blinked at you, lips parted, as if the question were in another tongue. You began to forget things too. What day it was, where you were born, whether the sun rose earlier yesterday or later. You said your own name aloud sometimes, just to keep it real, just to hear it in the air. One morning, you climbed to the crow's nest and looked out in all directions. There was nothing, no birds, no other sails, no currents you could trust, just the sound of the wind sighing through canvas and the soft thump of waves beneath your boots. The world had narrowed to the deck of this ship. It felt less like a vessel now, and more like a floating prison, a coffin with sails. You could feel it in the way men spoke, if they spoke at all. Their words grew sluggish, blurred at the edges. A sentence might take half a minute to form, a thought might vanish halfway through. Matteo had started talking to himself, not in whispers, but full conversations. You found him crouched in the hold one evening, cradling a bucket of seawater like an infant, murmuring to it in Spanish and stroking its rim. You asked him what he was doing. He smiled, glassy-eyed. "She's in there," he said. "She tells me things." You backed away. He didn't follow. Above deck, Leon's punishment had ended, but he hadn't spoken since. His face was swollen, his back torn to ribbons beneath the thin shirt they gave him. He walked like a man under water, slow, silent, half-absent. One night he began drawing symbols on the deck in chalk, circles within circles, stars without points, shapes that seemed to shift if you looked too long. The captain said nothing. He stayed at the helm most hours, eyes fixed ahead, jaw tight. You watched him from behind once, and noticed the tremble in his fingers as he turned the wheel. You saw the map too, spread out beside him, soaked with water, torn along the edges, covered in hasty ink marks. Entire coastlines had been crossed out, whole sections smudged to black. At the centre, an X had been carved into the parchment with a blade. There was no land near it, only sea. When the wind died, the silence became unbearable. It was not the silence of sleep or solitude, but the kind that presses at your ears, makes your chest feel hollow. You heard things in it, voices you couldn't place, a woman calling your name, the hiss of fire on wet wood, laughter that cut off too soon. One sailor, a man named Ruiz, carved tally marks into his arm. Each morning, a new line. Each night, he counted them aloud. You told him to stop. He smiled, showing blood-stained teeth. "I need to know it's real," he said. That night, the stars didn't come. Clouds blocked the sky, thick as wool. The moon vanished. The ship floated in darkness so complete you could not see your hand in front of your face. You lay in your hammock, eyes open, unsure whether they were open at all. Around you, the breathing of the crew seemed too loud, too close. You felt untethered, not just from land, but from time, from self. The next morning, the compass was gone. The navigator said it had fallen, slipped from the table and vanished into the sea. Some believed him, others didn't. A fistfight broke out that afternoon. Over bread, over water, over nothing. You didn't watch. You turned away and stared at the horizon, though it gave you nothing. And then, for just a moment, you thought you saw land again. A flicker, a shape, gone, as soon as it appeared. You didn't tell anyone. Not because you feared disbelief, but because part of you didn't want it to be real. Not anymore. You were too far gone for hope. All you wanted was something solid. A star that stayed still, a wave that moved in the right direction, a map that didn't lie, a compass that pointed somewhere, anywhere. Even if it was back, it wasn't a dream this time. The cry went up just before sunset, low and hoarse, the voice of a sailor who had long forgotten how to sound joyful. "Land," he rasped. "I see it." This time, no one rushed to the rails. No cheers, no prayers, just silence. Careful, deliberate silence. The silence of men who had been fooled before, who had watched hope dissolve like mist. Still, they climbed the rigging. Still, they looked, and there it was. Real, unmistakable. Land. A sliver of green rising from the sea like the back of some ancient creature, thick with trees, dark with vines. The coastline bled red under the weight of the setting sun, a deep, living scar between sea and forest. It shimmered like hot iron, and the sky above it burned orange. The colour of a promise kept too long. You leaned over the rail and stared, unwilling to blink, afraid that to close your eyes would make it vanish. But it didn't. It stayed, closer now. The captain gave no speech, no command to drop anchor, no blessing for safe landfall, just a nod, and the ship obeyed. The wind caught the sails with a whisper. The rudder groaned. The ropes sang in their pulleys. Men moved like ghosts, wordless, barefoot, thin as shadows. They prepared the longboats, gathered what little they had left to carry. Blunted blades, empty sacks, pieces of cloth though used more for memory than warmth. You were in the first boat. Matteo sat beside you, clutching a rusted knife in one hand and a water flask in the other, his eyes fixed on the shore, wide and bright. You thought he might cry? You thought you might too. The sea was calm, not out of kindness, but as if holding its breath. The longboat scraped the shore. You stepped out, knees shaking, and knelt in the red sand. It felt warm, real. Your fingers dug into it, clenching fistfuls. You pressed it to your face. It smelled of iron and leaves and ash. Behind you, others stumbled from the boats. Some fell to their knees. Some stood dumbfounded, turning in circles. A few kissed the ground. And then the forest loomed. It did not welcome. It watched. Trees taller than any you'd seen, thick as columns, covered in moss that pulsed faintly in the wind. Vines draped like nooses from the canopy. No birds called. No insects hummed. Just the rustle of leaves and the distant sound of something moving, not loud, not close, but present, waiting. You moved cautiously. Every step felt trespass. The captain led the way, machete in hand, slashing through the underbrush. The path opened slowly, reluctantly. You followed, heart-hammering. The air thickened, hot, damp, full of smells you couldn't name. Sweet rot, sharp resin, smoke not made by fire. Within the first hour, a sailor collapsed. Not from exhaustion, but fear. He dropped to the ground and whispered something over and over. Eyes in the trees. Eyes in the trees. You didn't look up. You didn't want to know. By nightfall, the forest had swallowed you. A clearing was chosen. Tents pitched from sails. A fire coaxed to life from damp wood. The smoke rose, pale and wavering, swallowed quickly by the leaves above. No one sang. No one spoke. Dinner was boiled roots and bitter leaves. You chewed slowly, teeth aching. It was more food than you'd had in days, but it brought no joy. Just fuel, just necessity. You sat near Matteo, watching the shadows dance along the tree trunks. "What do you think is out there?" he asked. not looking at you. You didn't answer, because you already knew. Not creatures, not spirits, judgment. This land did not belong to you. It did not welcome your boots or your blades. It breathed around you like lungs filled with old memory. It had seen men like you before, and it had not forgotten. That night, you lay beneath the trees and listened to the creak of branches, to the scurry of movement just beyond firelight, to the sound of the jungle remembering your steps. You dreamt of red sand swallowing your legs, the vines curling around your throat, of voices speaking in tongues you had never heard, but somehow understood. When you woke, you weren't sure if you had slept at all. The fire was dead. The forest was darker than before. The air still. You felt the land pressing in, not to crush, but to remind that you were an intruder, and that every breath you took from this place was borrowed. The jungle did not sleep, even in silence. It watched. You felt it, not with your eyes, but with the back of your neck, with the tightness in your chest. Every leaf whispered, every vine curled toward your feet. The air was thick enough to chew, warm and wet as breath. Each step through the underbrush was a negotiation. Each hour ashore felt borrowed from something ancient and unwilling to lend. The trees did not sway with the wind. They swayed with knowing. In the first days, men vanished. Not in screams, not in blood, just gone. One moment a man was collecting firewood, his back turned, his footsteps light. The next, he was air. You searched. You called his name. You followed the snapped twigs, the bent ferns, the faint indent of boot prints in the soil. But the trail always ended, as if the earth had closed around him, and you never found a body, not even a shred of cloth. The first time it happened, you blamed disorientation. The second, madness. The third, you blamed the jungle. A sailor named Diego returned on the third night. He had been gone for 2 days. No one had expected him back. When he stepped into the firelight, half naked, face hollow, arms scratched raw, silence fell like ash. He held something in his hands, a small carved figure made of wood and twine. He said nothing, just sat down by the fire and wept. Someone asked where he had been. He didn't answer. Later, you noticed his tongue was missing. No wound, just absence. No blood in his mouth, just a slow, vacant smile. The captain doubled the watch. Guards were posted. The fire burned brighter, but it made no difference. The jungle moved when it wanted. You tried to ignore it. You focused on work. The building of the shelter, the sorting of the supplies, the hunt for edible roots. You boiled bark, you chewed boiled grass, you sewed a tear in your shirt with a thorn, but you never turned your back on the trees. Mateo began talking in his sleep, murmured things in a language you didn't understand. You shook him awake. He looked at you as though he didn't know your name. And then the noises began. First, it was footsteps, light, deliberate, circling the camp just after midnight. Then whispers. Not the wind, not animals, voices, human, or something trying to be. A boy named Rodrigo stood watch on the 5th night. He was young, sharp-eyed, steady-handed. In the morning he was gone. His musket lay where he'd stood. No signs of struggle, only footprints. Your captain examined them, deep, straight. They didn't lead into the jungle, they led out, to the sea. Rodrigo had walked into the surf, and disappeared. The priest, what was left of him, said the jungle was cleansing you, one by one, removing the sickness of conquest. You didn't believe him, but you didn't disbelieve either, because something was here, something old, something watching. The captain grew thinner. He paced more, whispered to himself over the maps, scratched symbols into the bark of trees with a knife. You caught sight of one once, a spiral carved into a circle, lined with dots. It looked like an eye, or a trap. That night the forest glowed, not fully, just faintly a green shimmer along the leaves, like moonlight turned poisonous. The fire gave off no warmth. The shadows bent in strange ways. You didn't sleep. No one did. You sat in a circle, each man clutching whatever weapon he had. A rusted sword, a broken musket, a sharpened stick. Mateo had nothing but a rock. You kept watch until dawn. When the light returned, nothing had changed. But you all knew something had passed through. You found a mark on the ground, a footprint, but not human. Larger, wider, three-toed. No claws, No heel, just pressure. Deep, pressed into the red earth like a signature. The captain refused to speak of it, but the crew did. They spoke of spirits, of guardians, of something that lived in the trees and remembered every trespass. You tried to ignore them, until you found the totem. It was hanging from a branch. A crude face carved from bone and bound with sinew, its mouth sewn shut, its eyes filled with moss. Beneath it hung a length of human hair, braided with dried flowers. You stared at it for a long time, trying not to blink, trying not to see yourself in it. You turned away. You said nothing. That night, the wind returned. It carried no scent, but it did carry a sound. Laughter, high, distant, and cruel. You pressed your back to a tree and closed your eyes. You whispered an apology you weren't sure you meant. And the jungle listened. It always had. The ship looked different when you returned to her. She sat lower in the water, though no storm had battered her. No new cargo had been loaded. It was as if sorrow had waked, as if grief soaked into the timber. Her masts rose into the sky like old bones, stripped of flesh, pointing not to heaven but to something beyond reach. You stepped aboard with bare feet, sand still clinging to your soles. The planks felt unfamiliar beneath you. Each creak, each groan of wood sounded like a voice. Not a whisper, not a cry, but something else, a memory that refused to fade. The crew was smaller now. You counted as you moved across the deck. Fewer faces, hollow eyes, no laughter, no greetings, just the scrape of buckets, the snap of rope, the wind pulling at sails that no longer billowed the way they once had. The jungle had taken many, and what it didn't take, the silence did. The captain stood at the helm again, gaunt, sunburnt, cloaked in stillness. His right hand trembled as he gripped the wheel. You watched him turn it, slow and measured, eyes fixed on the horizon. He spoke only twice that day. First, to say the heading. Second, to ask if the stars still moved. No one answered. You returned to your place below deck. The hammocks swayed like ghosts. You climbed into yours and stared upward. Above you, the boards of the ceiling bore the carvings of men now gone. Names, prayers, curses and tallies. Mateo's hammock was still strung beside yours, but he was not in it. He had vanished the night before departure. No trace. Not into the jungle. Not into the sea. Just gone. You said nothing when the captain ordered the sails raised. You only watched as the coastline slipped away, the red shore bleeding into blue, and the forest, quiet now, swallowed itself. The first days back at sea were too quiet. You missed even the groaning of the sick, the muttered threats, the snore of a man too tired to dream. Now there was only wind, and wood, and breath. The crew avoided one another. You passed men without speaking. You ate alone. You drank your ration in silence. The hammock swung with an eerie rhythm, as if the ship moved, not with the sea, but with its own sorrow. The galley smelled of mildew and memory. No cook remained. No priest. No boy to sing beneath his breath. Only sailors with sunken cheeks and wide, unblinking eyes. They said little, but you could feel it in their gaze. They carried the jungle with them, not in their hands, but in their minds. One night you stood at the stern and looked out over the wake. The stars above were clear, too clear. They stared down like teeth, white, sharp, unchanging. You thought of Mateo, of his whisper, "She's still hungry." You thought of Leon, who now sat in silence beneath the mainmast, fingers tracing patterns on the deck. He no longer spoke of rebellion. He no longer spoke at all. You wondered what he saw when he looked at the sky. That same night, a man jumped overboard. No shout, no splash, just the absence. You noticed at breakfast, one less bowl, one less pair of boots, one more rope left, coiled and untouched. The captain did not call account. He did not speak to the crew. He stood at the helm as always, head tilted toward the sky, as though trying to hear something from the stars. You began to dream again. But they were not dreams of food or warmth or land. You dreamed of rope, not holding the sails, but holding your wrists. You dreamed of water that boiled and hissed without flame. You dreamed of voices chanting in a language made of wind and rain. One morning you found salt beneath your nails. You hadn't touched the sea. The men began to call her the ghost ship, not out loud, not in daylight, but in whispers, in mutters, in the look they gave one another when the sails flapped without wind or the lanterns flickered without breeze. They said the jungle had followed you, not with vines, but with memory, and memory, like the sea, never lets go. You cleaned your blade that evening, for the first time in weeks. Not because you feared others, but because you feared forgetting how to feel something sharp. The stars blinked above you, the sea whispered its secrets, and below, the ship groaned once more, not in protest, but in grief. A grief made of all the names no longer spoken, a grief heavy enough to sink you, even if the hull stayed dry. They called you survivors now, but there was nothing victorious in that word. Nothing proud. It clung to you like wet cloth, cold, clinging, impossible to shed. A survivor, yes. But of what? A voyage, a sickness, a silence, or something deeper, something you hadn't yet named? The days blurred again, but differently now. Not with labor, nor with longing, but with emptiness. You rose, you worked, you slept. But the meaning had gone. The ship drifted on currents none could name. The compass had stopped being consulted. The stars were watched only for rhythm, not direction. You knew the ship was pointed home. At least, that's what they said. But the word home no longer carried a shape. The men had changed. The sea had not broken their bodies. It had broken something quieter. Their laughter, their music, their rituals. Now, even the familiar acts, coiling rope, scrubbing boards, repairing canvas, felt hollow. Done without thought, without purpose, a pantomime of life. Leo, once the loudest voice on deck, had become a shadow. He didn't speak. He didn't work. He sat beneath the mizzenmast each day, carving the same shape into a scrap of driftwood, a spiral with no end, deep and jagged. He bled as he worked, but never flinched. You avoided looking at him. You avoided looking at anyone. At meals, the silence was worse than hunger had ever been. A bowl of dry biscuit, a cup of tepid water, and nothing else. Even Matteo, had he still been there, would have filled the space with something. But now there was no one who dared. The captain? He was not gone, not entirely, but he had changed too. He no longer stood tall. He leaned, slightly, always slightly, as though the weight of the voyage bent his spine a little more each day. His eyes were still sharp, but they had dulled at the edges, like glass left to weather in the sun. He gave orders only when necessary, and when he spoke, he no longer used names, only roles. Sailor, rope, watch, stern. Never you, never him, never us. The sky was blue now, the sea calm. But the world inside the ship had not thawed. Each night, you lay in your hammock and listened to the nothing. No snoring, no coughing, no whispers, only the breath of the sea against the hull and the groan of the mast above. The ship moved as a ghost moves, without sound, without urgency, without destination. You dreamed again, of a harbour, of bells ringing. But when you approached the dock, no one was there. Just empty streets and flickering lamps and the sound of footsteps that were not your own. You woke with salt on your lips, not from the sea, but from tears. No one noticed. No one spoke of dreams anymore. They feared them. You spoke to the sails, not out loud, just in your mind. You asked them where they were taking you. You asked if they remembered the hands that first tied them, the wind that first kissed them. You asked if they missed the land as much as you did. They said nothing, only fluttered softly in the breeze, like sighs trapped in cloth. The ship creaked, the ropes tightened, and the sea, ever patient, bore you on. Then, one morning, without ceremony, without warning, a sailor shouted, "Land." This time, no one moved. You stayed seated. You didn't look. You waited to see if he'd say it again, if others would echo, if the word would catch, like flame. It didn't. He repeated it, once, twice, then fell silent. You stood slowly, legs weak from stillness, walked to the bow. There it was, a strip of grey, jagged at the edges, real, definitive, land. But no one cheered, no one cried. No one whispered thanks to God or kissed the deck or clasped hands in joy, because what waited on that land was not home. It was a reckoning of all the things lost, all the people buried, all the names forgotten, and of what kind of man might step off this ship and still pretend to be whole, You looked at your hands. They had grown thin, calloused, alien. You flexed your fingers and wondered what they might touch again, what they might build, or carry, or hold. And you felt nothing. Not hope, not fear, just the weight of having survived. And the knowledge that not all who survive truly return. The harbour looked the same. Same towers, same gulls, same brittle sails, sagging in the dock's breeze. The same smell, fish and wood smoke, and tar baked into the stones. But as you stepped off the ship and onto the dock, your boots meeting land for the first time in weeks, in months, something inside you recoiled. It was not home. It was the ghost of home. You moved slowly, as if the ground might give way beneath you. The shift from the roll of the deck to the stillness of stone unbalanced you. Not your body, but your sense of self. You weren't sure if you were walking or remembering how to walk. The crew disembarked in silence, one by one. No cheers, no embraces, no trumpets. You saw familiar buildings. The bell tower, where you once begged for bread. The fishmonger's stall, closed for the evening. The inn with crooked windows that once held laughter, song, the warmth of another body beside your own. But now the streets were lined with strangers. Not unfamiliar faces, but familiar faces that did not know you anymore. You passed a woman sweeping her stoop. She glanced up, then away, not seeing you. A child pointed, asking something, and was hushed quickly. You moved on, shadow among shadows. No one greeted you. No one gasped. No one wept with joy. Because no one had waited, and why should they have? You had left with nothing but the promise of glory. You returned with salt in your beard and ghosts in your eyes. Someone called out behind you, a sailor reunited with a cousin, an old friend. There were shouts, an embrace. You paused, listened, then turned away. You couldn't bear it. You walked through the streets like a man underwater, sounds muffled, faces warped by memory. At the door of your old tavern, you stopped. The lantern still burned above it, crooked and warm. You placed your hand on the doorframe. The wood felt the same, sticky with old ale, scarred by knives, marked with initials. You used to know. You did not enter. Instead, you walked to the alley behind it, where you had once shared a bottle with a girl whose name you could no longer summon. You sat on a crate, let your hands hang between your knees. Let the world spin slowly back into place. A voice asked if you needed food. You looked up into the eyes of a stranger. A boy, no older than 16. He offered a crust of bread. You took it, not out of hunger, but because you wanted to remember how to say thank you. The words stuck in your throat. You nodded instead. You walked away. You chewed slowly, the bread turning to dust on your tongue. The wind carried the scent of salt and rotting seaweed. You shivered. The dock bells rang in the distance. Evening settled like fog. You stood and walked again, unsure where your feet were leading. You passed a chapel. The door was open. Candles flickered inside. You did not enter. You did not kneel. Instead, you sat on the steps and looked out at the water. The ship still floated there, at anchor, smaller now, darker. It looked like a coffin. You heard someone sit beside you, an old man, thin, hunched, hands stained with ink. He looked at you for a long while, then asked quietly, "Was it worth it?" You didn't answer. Not because you didn't want to, but because you didn't know. How do you measure worth? In coins? In story? In how many of your crewmates returned? Or in what pieces of yourself you left behind? The man nodded as if he heard your silence, then stood and walked away. You sat there until the bells rang again, until the candles in the chapel flickered low, until the stars began to form their cold constellations above the harbour. And still, you did not move, because you were afraid. Not of the sea, not of hunger or fever or storms, but of walking into a room and hearing someone say, "You're back," and not knowing what to say in return, because you were not back. Not really. You were only a reflection, a ripple in the port's memory. A man shaped like the one who had left, but filled with different bones, different dreams, different shadows. You stood at last, walked down the steps, and vanished into the dark. It came in a small, rusted pouch. You had to sign for it. Ink on parchment. A clerk with a quill and an oily grin, seated behind a table stacked with ledgers, His fingers moved with speed, scratching down names, numbers, amounts owed, amounts paid. He barely looked at you, just pointed to the space on the page. You stared at your name for a long time. It looked foreign, misshapen. You signed anyway. He handed you the pouch with the care one might offer a dying bird. "There you go," he said. "Your share." You took it. It was heavier than you expected, but not heavy enough. You walked away from the table before opening it. Outside, the wind had shifted. The salt air had returned, clinging to your sleeves, curling into your hair. You loosened the drawstring and tilted the pouch into your palm. 12 coins. Bronze and silver, dulled with age, edges worn smooth. A few bore the crown, one bore the cross. All of them felt cold. You turned them over in your hand, one by one. These were the spoils. This was what you had bled for, what you had burned for, what you had watched men die for. You closed your hand and felt their chill press into your skin. Somewhere, a bell rang. A wagon passed by, wheels creaking. You stood there in the square, forgotten by the crowd, just another man in threadbare clothes holding his worth in one hand. You remembered the promises, riches beyond imagining, gold poured like wine, jewels the size of eggs. You remembered the captain's voice, bright and hard, swearing on stars and scripture that your sacrifice would not be in vain. And now here you stood, with 12 coins. A man had sold his teeth for less. You dropped them into your pocket and walked. The streets were quiet. The world had moved on. No one recognized you now. Not as a sailor. Not as anything. You passed a shop window and caught your reflection, thinner, older, eyes ringed with a tiredness that sleep could never mend. You wondered if the sea had taken your youth with it. You wandered without aim until the chapel rose before you. The same one you'd passed before, its door still cracked open. You entered. The air was warm inside, dusty, the scent of wax and old wood wrapped around you like a shawl. A woman prayed in the front pew, her head bowed, her lips moving without sound. You didn't disturb her. You moved quietly to the back, knelt on creaking floorboards, and opened the pouch once more. You took out the coins, laid them on the ground before you. Watched the way they caught the light. They looked brighter here, under the glow of candles. Less curt, more honest. You picked up one and studied it, a silver piece with the king's face. His eyes were empty, his mouth cruel. You pressed your thumb against it until the imprint stung. Then you stood. You walked around the side of the chapel, to a narrow patch of dirt beneath a dying tree. You knelt and dug, with your hands, with your nails, with the flat edge of a stone. You dug until the earth gave way, until the soil clung to your wrists like grief. And then you buried them, all 12, one by one. Pressed them into the ground like seeds you hoped would never grow. You covered them gently, smoothed the dirt, whispered something you couldn't hear, then stood and walked away, not quickly, not solemnly, just finally. You didn't look back. You didn't mark the spot, because what you left there was not treasure. It was memory, debt, weight, and you had carried it long enough. Years passed. They slipped by like ships in a fog, silent, slow, unremarked. You did not return to sea, not again, not ever. You found a room in a village far from the port, where the wind smelled of pine instead of brine and the church bells rang in kindness, not mourning. Some days you worked the fields, other days you simply sat and watched them sway. People knew your name, or thought they did. You answered to it, but it no longer felt yours. Sometimes you laughed. Sometimes you sat with a woman in the evenings, her fingers brushing yours beneath the table, her voice a balm in the dimness. Sometimes you held a child. Maybe it was yours, maybe not. It didn't matter. The sea stayed away from your door, but not from your dreams. At night, it crept in, not with storm or spray, but with salt. You tasted it on your tongue as you slept. You felt it in your joints, your knuckles aching with each tide of memory. You dreamed of sails, not white and full, but tattered, hollow, of a jungle breathing green heat, of Mateo's eyes wide with things he never said. You woke often, sweat cooling against your spine, heart heavy as iron. The doctor said it was your age, but you knew better. It was the ocean, still inside you. You saw it sometimes, from the cliffs, just a glimpse, far beyond the fields, where the sky folded into blue. You never went to it, never stepped foot on the sand, but it was there, patient, unchanged. One morning, long after the first grey streaked your hair, you felt something stir. Not fear, not guilt, but a longing. Not to sail again, not to chase glory, or gold, or God, but to return, to leave something behind. You rose early, tied your cloak, walked. The road was long, but your steps were steady. When you reached the shore, the air was cold. The waves broke soft as breath against the rocks. No gulls cried, no ship stood at anchor. Just the sea, wide and indifferent, whispering its old, unfinished story. You took off your boots, let the sand claim your soles, waded until the water touched your ankles. It was cold, but not cruel, familiar, like the hand of a brother long gone. You stood there a long time, listening, breathing. You whispered something into the wind. Not a prayer, not a plea, just a name. Maybe yours, maybe one you'd forgotten. And the sea did not answer. It never does. But it listened. You felt it in your bones. The tide receding not just from the shore, but from your chest, like exhaling. You stayed until the stars returned, until the sky darkened, and the wind curled around you like a shawl. Then you turned and walked home. You did not look back, not this time, because you knew now, the sea never truly leaves you. It settles beneath your skin, in the curve of your spine, in the ache of your knees, in the silence between heartbeats, and in the moments when you close your eyes and still feel the ship swaying gently beneath your feet. As the last embers of this voyage fade into quiet, I hope the echo of it stays with you like salt on the skin or a whisper on the wind. If this story found a place in your heart, subscribe and return again to the quiet waters of forgotten history. What part of this journey stayed with you the most? As the last wave fades from this forgotten voyage, I hope it leaves a hush in your heart. Thank you for sailing through this silence with me. If you wish to drift again through stories the world has buried, subscribe, and together we'll keep the past from sinking alone. Could you have stepped aboard, knowing the cost? What part of this voyage still echoes inside you?